Welcome back to Fix and Rex, a fanfiction podcast. I'm WMN. A glimpse into married pollen bliss with a touch of angst. Today we bring you Safe Haven by It Was Glorious. This story contains adult themes and is rated mature. For more information about story content, as well as a link to the fic, please reference the episode description of this podcast. Thank you, It Was Glorious, for allowing us to record your story. He watched her as she walked down the stairs. A delicate hand on the railing. Delicate fingers, delicate steps, a delicate dress. Not yellow, but light blue. Tiny flowers stitched onto it. And he couldn't help but smile at her. That was his wife. "You look beautiful," he murmured as she approached him. "The dress was made before the news. It's a little tight," she answered, a shy smile on her face. Yet, as she was looking up at him, her eyes dancing in happiness, he swore that she had never looked so beautiful. It was still their private little secret, their own little family expanding, growing bigger. He couldn't be more excited. Secretly, he wished for a girl, a little mini Penelope, someone to spoil like he had spoiled his little nieces. "Are you ready to go?" he asked, holding out his hand. She put her gloved one in his and squeezed, and he couldn't help but bring it to his mouth and drop a small kiss on her bare wrist. In the carriage, seated next to her husband and on the way to Bridgerton House, Penelope reminisced about the previous weeks. It had been magnificent and yet exhausting. Colin had proven to be a wonderful husband. Wonderfully irritating and irritatingly wonderful in his overprotectiveness. "Do I enjoy the pleasure of a dance tonight? Or will you keep on pretending I'm made of glass?" "You may not be made of glass, dear wife, but you're still very precious to me," he said with a wink. "That does not necessarily answer my question." Colin remained silent for a second. "If you refuse to dance with me, I may have to find someone that will," she quipped, her tone light-hearted but her eyes mischievous. Colin tensed ever so slightly and felt a spark of anger, not directed at his wife, but at the unfortunate fella who would agree to dance with his wife that night. "That will not be necessary," he said, his tone serious and taking on a darker edge. Penelope smiled triumphantly, dropping a small kiss on his jawline before settling back into her seat and sneaking her arm through his. And although he continued staring straight ahead, his gaze fixed on some spot in the distance, his posture softened ever so slightly, and a small smile grazed his lips. He slipped his hand into hers and squeezed. The rest of the ride was spent in comfortable silence, both of them staring at the city passing by outside, lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at Bridgerton House, Colin jumped out of the carriage easily and ushered away any servant willing to help his wife. He was damn well going to do that himself. "Penelope, Colin, we're delighted you could come." Kate greeted them, standing beside her own husband, a knowing smile on her lips. Penelope had had to confide in her about her pregnancy, since she herself had been shockingly unaware of what to expect. The room at Bridgerton House had been transformed into a ballroom with beautiful flowers adorning walls and ceiling, and a small stage set at the front where an opera singer as well as 2 ballet dancers were entertaining guests. "The room looks wonderful," Penelope said, her eyes settling on the stage. Kate, following her gaze, mentioned, "That's Julia Corelli," then added in a murmur that seemed to be directed at her husband more than anyone else, I certainly won't be inviting Sienna Rosso anytime soon. All Antony did was clear his throat loudly, dropped a kiss on Kate's head, and mumbled something about needing to greet guests. Penelope looked baffled and turned to Colin, a questioning look in her eyes, but his gaze was fixed on the stage, eyes squinting. She had to tug at his hand to get him to focus on the conversation again. He snapped back with a quick, "Yes, certainly. The room looks great, Kate. I'd like to get Penelope some refreshments, so if you would excuse us." And with that, he dragged his wife across the room as far away from the stage as possible. When he finally stopped, turning around with one of his most charming smiles and a quick, "What may I serve you, dear wife?" she couldn't help but ask, "What has gotten into you?" "I'm unsure as to when taking care of my pregnant wife has become unexpected behavior," he answered, a shy smile on his lips and kiss on the back of her hand momentarily robbing her of coherent speech. Never mind," was the only reply she could muster before spotting Hyacinth and Violet, who made their way over to them. Less than an hour later, with the ball in full swing and Colin in a good mood, joking around with Simon and Antony on the other side of the room, Penelope considered it to be her moment to strike. She excused herself from the conversation with her sister and slowly made her way over to the two Bridgertons and their brother-in-law, all while being careful not to bump into anyone. "No, but what you do not seem to have, my dear brother-in-law, is a fighting spirit when it comes to Pall Mall. There's no friendship, there's no family, there's only the game and the willingness to do what it takes to win," Colin said. "It seems that I will have to join one of these games one day. Surely you'd be willing to help me succeed, wouldn't you?" Penelope said softly as she stood behind Colin. He startled and turned around. Opening his mouth, he seemed to be at a loss for words. But her husband wouldn't be her husband if he didn't compose himself rather quickly and answer, "I might need some convincing for that to happen." He smiled, a wicked gleam in his eyes, and Penelope felt the blush creep up on her cheeks. For a second, all they did was stare into each other's eyes, lost in their silent conversation and promises of things to come. "Heavens, would you two stop?" Antony groaned. Simon's only reaction before he excused himself from the conversation to find his own wife was a muttered, "As if you and Kate are any better." All Antony did was roll his eyes. "I know it's customary for the man to ask the woman for a dance, but I believe it's high time I become more demanding. So, would you be so kind as to offer me your next dance?" Penelope asked. When he didn't answer right away, Pen offered up her hand with a little bow. When she heard her husband snort softly and take her hand, she knew she had won. While leading her to the dance floor, he dropped down a bit to whisper in her ear, "Are you sure this is fine? Are you well enough?" All Penelope did was roll her eyes, as if she would have asked him if she wasn't feeling well. He really was adorably irritating in his concern. Arriving at the center of the room, he slowly took her hand in his while his other one rested on her back. And just like that, she was transformed back to the time when her dresses hadn't been blue or green, but yellow. To the time when he had done this because he'd been told to the time when he'd liked her, but hadn't seen her. As he looked at her nostalgic smile, he felt his heart contract slightly in regret. He was sure there had been a reason for why it had taken him years to recognize the utterly breathtaking woman in his arms for who she was. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but wonder, in moments like this especially, how many more of her adorable giggles, enchanting smiles, and thrilling kisses he could have already had he gotten his head out of his arse sooner. When the dance was over, the two of them snapped out of their bubble. "Thank you for this wonderful dance," Colin whispered, leaning down to bring her hand to his lips, his smoldering eyes never leaving hers. He tried to convey much in that kiss. Things that had already been said before, but things that she deserved to hear, feel, and believe every day. Penelope felt the heat rise in her and whispered breathlessly, "I think I will take that refreshment now," to which he saluted with a quick, "Of course, my lady. What can I get you?" "I'd love some iced lemon water," Penelope answered. Colin grinned, knowing that that was the drink she'd been craving her entire, albeit short, pregnancy so far. While Colin was off in search of her drink, Penelope walked over to the food table to get a bite to eat. Looking at the eclairs, she couldn't help but smile to herself and take one. But as this seemed to be the night of déjà vu, the cream decided to escape from the side she was not biting into, and this time, it didn't land on the floor, but her chest. Penelope felt the embarrassment rise in her cheeks and took a quick look around to see if anyone had seen her. For the first time in her life, she was thankful that she had blended into the background yet again, as she had done on so many nights of her life. Darting out of the room, she tried to make her way to a washroom as quickly as possible, but heard familiar voices in the library adjoining the ballroom. And while she did not want to eavesdrop, the sound of her husband speaking to another woman in a room by themselves did make her feel somewhat entitled to listen to that particular conversation. So she slowly walked towards the open doorway, paying close attention not to become visible to the people inside. "I heard you were married, my lord." "I was. Happily." "I guessed so, since I haven't heard from you in more than 2 years. Penelope did not hear Colin's reply, because an especially shrill laugh from Cressida Cowper in the adjoining room made her jump, which consequently made Colin look in her direction and pale. "Penelope." She blushed a bit, having been caught in the act, but steeled herself. She was not the one with any secrets, and she would not be the one backing down. Not when she'd just walked in on her husband talking to a lady he seemed to know, or had known, quite well. Even if it felt like her heart was beating out of her chest. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice suspiciously sweet. "Not at all. I was just talking to Miss Adkins about her spectacular performance on stage tonight. She's the ballerina," Colin answered. His eyes darted nervously between the two ladies while he stepped towards Penelope. "Here's your drink, my love," he said, handing her the drink and dropping a kiss on her hand. Penelope, however, continued to stare at Miss Adkins, willing her to speak first. And after a few moments, she did. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Bridgerton." The ballerina mumbled and darted out of the room with a quiet, "If you would excuse me," leaving Colin and Penelope in uncomfortable silence. Colin quickly turned towards her, putting the drink down on a shelf beside them, reaching for her hand. Was she? They started speaking at the same time. After 2 seconds, Colin whispered, "Yes, she was," while looking down at her limp hand in his. "Oh," was all Penelope said for what felt like ages. She didn't know what to say. It wasn't exactly surprising. She knew that Colin hadn't been unexperienced when he entered their marriage. She wasn't naive. She just never expected to meet one of them, and most of all, she didn't expect it to sting so much. "It was more than 2 years ago, before Cyprus, and long before you," he said sheepishly. "I know," was all Penelope managed to answer. And that's how they stood there. Penelope staring at the floor, Colin staring at her hand in his, the silence stretching between them. He, desperately wanting to fill it, she, not knowing how to end it. And each second, the insecurity in her heart grew stronger, and each second, his need to reassure her grew stronger. "It's not. Pen, there's no comparison. You know that, right? All of that? It doesn't compare." He squeezed her hand while his other one softly grasped her chin and lifted her head. "I know you love me. It's not that. I'm just I've spent years not being noticed, not only by you, but not by anyone. And deep inside, I've always known who I was, but it wasn't easy not having anyone else, with the exception of Eloise, notice it. Not being desired, always feeling like a burden. And while she spoke, something inside Colin changed. She could see it in his eyes. They went from silently pleading for her to understand to blazing with anger, with desire, with love for her. You have never, for 1 second, been a burden to me. Pen, you don't understand. You don't understand what you mean to me, what you've always meant to me, he said, the words bubbling out of him faster and faster, both his hands now gripping hers. His eyes staring into her very soul with a desperation she hadn't seen in him before. You've been my safe haven. All my life, you've been there. You've never changed, always been so unequivocally yourself. You don't understand how intimidating that is to someone who's always looking, searching for his purpose, for himself. All Penelope could do was stare at him, her mouth slightly agape, her breaths coming fast. Last year, I finally realized what I should have realized long ago. That what I was looking for was you. You're my haven, Penelope. You have been all along. You've always been there to remind me of who I am, even if I didn't know yet. And for that alone, I will love you till my dying breath. She stared at him, her chest feeling like it was ready to burst. And all she could do was raise herself on her tiptoes and kiss him. And she poured every emotion that was screaming to leave her body into that kiss. He interrupted the kiss only to whisper against her lips, I would lay down my life for you and our child. Penelope's smile took his breath away. She was beauty. She was the sun. Thank you, she whispered softly, jumping up to give him a quick kiss one last time. They remained standing there for just a few more moments, not ready to leave just yet, gazes interlocked. What actually made you leave the ballroom anyway? Colin asked. Penelope, brought back to the present momentarily, felt herself blush while she giggled. My chest is full of eclair cream, she said. Is it? Colin asked, eyeing her bosom curiously. How was it? How was what? Penelope asked, puzzled. There was a wicked gleam in his eyes. The eclair. Their eyes locked, and suddenly a new heat spread to Penelope's cheeks, one that had nothing to do with any embarrassment. Delicious, she whispered, her voice raspy. Colin leaned down slowly, licking down her neck until he landed at her bosom. Penelope's head fell back and a soft little sigh escaped her lips. When Colin's tongue softly found its way to that spot between her breasts. Delicious, Colin repeated, and stood back up again, rather abruptly. When he glanced at Penelope's delirious yet outraged face, he started laughing. How about I call for our carriage and we make our way home? Thank you for listening to another episode of Fix and Rex. Stay tuned for our next episode, an interview with Safe Haven author It Was Glorious, where we chat about fandom, fan fiction, and their favorite pollen fic. Until then, I'm WMN. Happy reading.